ground rules for the session. The session is being recorded from this moment onwards, and it is also being live streamed on YouTube so that you can go back to it whenever you'd like to listen to it later. We will share the link of it on the chat shortly. Please stay on mute in case you want to speak in the Q&A session that we will have towards the end. You can raise your hands. Turn on your videos if it is possible. Um, Please feel free to put in your questions in the chat box. We will invite you to interact with our speakers after the fireside chat. And please feel free to put your comments, any feedback. You can also email it to us. You can write to us. The theme for today's session is Reflections from the COP28. The Conference of Parties, the 28th one, was recently concluded at Dubai, United Arab Emirates. It was one of the biggest of its kind. The COP, as they are called, have become even more complex over the years. Complex in its negotiations, complex in the actors involved, complex in the ideas that come out of it. For us, someone who are located outside this space, it is not easy to comprehend what is happening. It is not easy to understand and take stock of what happens at the COP and how does it matter? And most importantly, why is it important to know that? I too have so many questions, and I am sure most of you who have joined us also do. The objective of today's session will be to understand what the world of COP is, what happens there, and why is it important. And we will listen to this from the perspective of four young, brilliant speakers who have joined with us today from different parts of the world. They are negotiators of their respective countries and have been involved in the COP processes. Before that, let me give you a quick introduction to our organization. The session would not have been possible without the Youth Negotiators Academy. It is an organization that imparts training to young negotiators on the hows and the ways of climate negotiations that take place at the COP. They have successfully concluded the second year of their operations and have trained around 125 negotiators from 54 countries between the age groups of 18 to 35. Finally, about the ClimAct initiative. The ClimAct initiative works passionately towards making climate education intersectional, holistic, actionable, and accessible for all. Our goal is to mobilize the youth and communities to be agents of change by equipping communities and citizens like all of you to take effective climate action. We do this through two programs, the Green Warriors and the Mind the Gap. In the Green Warriors program, we work with children and youth to help them take action and be change makers in their own rights. Through Mind the Gap, we work with organizations, communities, and companies to best understand the gaps in their knowledge and demystify climate change, environment, and sustainability concepts for them. We also hold community building spaces through the initiative known as Listening Circle. And finally, Earth Talks. Earth Talks is a platform wherein we bring in experts on the field and strike a conversation on relevant topics related to environment, climate change, and sustainable. That is all from my side. Now, let us get into the next session of next part of the session, that is the fireside chat. This will be moderated by Neha. Neha, over to you.
Thank you so much, Aishwarya, for setting the stage just right. And a very warm welcome to all of you once again. So happy to be moderating this important conversation. As we've heard a lot of times, we are the first generation to feel the effect of climate change and the last generation who can do something about it. If we cannot feel this today, then when? And if not us, then who? And this has been a very pertinent question. And for this, today we are joined by four such youth negotiators who've been a part of the delegations of their countries to the COP and have engaged in negotiations in different capacities. They are truly change makers and inspiring for all of us. So let us have them and introduce themselves and know more about their journeys in the conversation that is going to follow us. So over to Alia, would you like to start with your introduction and we can continue the chain?
Hi everyone. It's good to see you again. It's good to see some familiar faces. My name is Leah Zghib. I'm from Lebanon. I negotiate on adaptation and transparency. Um, Now, do you like me to go more in detail or later, and I just pass it to
Yeah,
someone else?
sure. Please feel free to talk about your backgrounds and how did you actually start your profession as a COP negotiator and which particular items you negotiate on.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll try to make it quick so everyone else can get a turn. As I said, my name is Leah. I work at the Ministry of Environment in Lebanon. I work with the Climate Change Unit. My background, my bachelor's in water resources and geoenvironmental sciences, and my master's was in environmental planning and management. Um, I'm I started actually working the first couple of years. I didn't even know anything about negotiations or the UNFCCC or just like the big bullet points of the Paris Agreement. But I was working as a researcher on more technical stuff like GIS mapping, data analysis, implementing projects on the ground, more that has to do with stakeholder mapping, assessments, working with municipalities. So that's kind of my job until I started working with the ministry. And that's when I started with the CYMP program, which was, I think, a year and a half ago. I was part of the first cohort with Namgai. So after that, it was like a crash course into negotiations. And considering that I work on adaptation projects in Lebanon and I'm part of the two people team that write the national communications. So we do the entire assessments, I do the projections, and then we did the fourth national communication that was launched last year. And now we're in the process of writing the biannual transparency report, so which is supposed to be at the end of this year, as well as the low emission development strategies I'm writing right now, which also is supposed to be done by this year. And we're updating our NDCs. So it's a big, and we're only a team of four. So it's a lot of work. But yes, that is what I do, and that's my background. I'll pass it over to one of the new kids. Sorry, Namgay. Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Thank you, Leah. Malolele, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Gite. I'm from the Kingdom of Tonga. I am, however, currently based in New York for a program, so it's very cold over here. But it's wonderful to meet you all and connect. I, in 2017, founded a non-government organization called Take the Lead. And the whole purpose of Take the Lead was to develop the leadership of underrepresented groups in Tonga, which includes young people, women, LGBT. And in that, we found ourselves also running educational programs around climate. And we've seen a real impact in some of these projects where we've had some of our young leaders engage in national decision-making dialogues as well as regional, and most recently through HETA and her wonderful program through the Young Negotiators. Not just myself was able to attend, but also one of our alumni from one of our programs, which is called She Leads Parliament. I think I'll leave it at that because I'll maybe share more of my work later. But yes, I'll pass it on now to Charlene. We'll keep it Pacific for now, and then yeah.
Kia ora and warm Pacific greetings to you all. My name is Charlene Hoff. I am from the Cook Islands. I currently live in the Cook Islands and I work for our government here, specifically the Office of the Prime Minister, working in the Central Policy Development Division, and I am a policy analyst. My background is in educational background is in business. However, I've been working and developing national policies as well as providing advice to our Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers on national matters. In terms of my, I guess, placement at COP28, I was following the thematic area of mitigation at COP28. This is my first time as a negotiator, however, not my first time at COP. And so at COP27, I was there, but based at the Moana Pacific Blue Pavilion, supporting SPREP. And so at COP28, I was fortunately given the opportunity to negotiate on behalf of my country. And I guess for us, because we're a small delegation that attends COP, we've never had anyone follow the theme area of mitigation. So this was one of the important roles for, or what our director or head of delegation wanted me to be part of and continue to be part of. But yes, I guess that's all from me, and I'm glad to see everyone and reconnect, and yeah, excited for this panel ahead. Thank you, and I'll pass it on to Nimge.
Hi everyone, my name is Namgit Chodan. I am currently based in Thimphu, which is the capital city of Bhutan, and we're neighbors with a lot of, I do see a lot of Indian attendees here. I started my career in the government, in the foreign service, and I never thought that I would be working in the environment/climate space. But I was given the opportunity to be a young negotiator at COP27, which really was a high point as I left my career in the government to focus full-time on climate. After that, I've also been at the Bonn Intercessions and then COP28. I currently work for a civil society organization in Bhutan called the Bhutan Ecological Society. And in my very peculiar position of not being in the government, but being part of the negotiators team, I have been working on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is on basically instituting a UN carbon market, both at a country-to-country level, but also at a centralized high-level level. And the way I see my role in my organization and in my country is really to push for a lot of capacity building for carbon markets, both in the compliance, but also the voluntary market space. And for a country like Bhutan to be able to equitably participate in all these multilateral processes that ultimately needs to be translated into local policy. In addition to that, I am also a global shaper and a climate reality leader. So I'm personally very passionate about climate literacy, particularly for young people in Bhutan. And I'll keep it at here. Happy to speak more about Article 6 later.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing a brief introduction, because it really tells us how different all of you are. But what is common is that you act as a bridge, between the voices of common communities and common people and the international policy makers or the people at the table. So I think this is such an important context that we all needed, and thank you for the work you do. And I'm sure we are all excited to delve right into getting more details about what you do, and especially with regard to COP28, what were the significant developments from your particular track, and in general, which stand out for you as negotiators, or anything else as well. So before we get into that round, firstly, I'll also especially want to thank Charlene. She's joining us at 3:30 a.m. From very early. So thank you for making it here. Really happy to have you. Thank you for making time. And now into the round two. So I would like to begin this with Namge. You talked about your active role in the civil society organizations, uh, and how you are not in the government but part of the negotiators team. So how was it, how has your experience been, maintaining that balance and making sure that you are also giving that justice to the communities that you represent and at the same time represent the government? And how was your experience at COP28 specifically? Over to you.
Well, I think there is a misconception that for somebody to be part of the UNFCCC process, that they have to necessarily belong to the government. I think it really depends on the capacity and the openness of the government, who definitely should be leading and coordinating, the country position, etc. So yeah, as I say, I find myself in a very peculiar space, and I do think that one really has to be able to show that there is a lot of value in including somebody like me, not only as somebody from outside the government, but even as a young person, because that is what it was at COP27. I found myself as the youngest person on the negotiators team. And at COP28, there was a visible shift in the makeup of the negotiators team. I'm not taking credit for it, but it's very interesting to see the shift where there were a lot more young people involved who were fully empowered to be representatives of the country. But of course, it's a little different again because countries don't always negotiate on their own. Just for the audience, we do it in coalition blocks. So Bhutan would be part of the LDC group. My experience, oh, it's been quite the journey. I would start by saying that it is a long game. If it's your first COP, if it's your first intercession, I think you can not be so hard on yourself, because there is a lot of history to why certain things are the way they are, including a lot of the relationships and the dynamics between the blocks, but also how certain issues evolved. At COP27, I thought I did enough prep. I did all the reading that I was supposed to do. But then when I went into the negotiators room, I found myself like, everyone is speaking English, but then I really don't understand what's going on. And I've shared this in one of our previous sessions with the CYNP, but my breakthrough really came at Bonn, because then, so for me, for example, it was when a certain issue was introduced, and then that kind of carried on to COP28. And at COP28 in Dubai, I could tell myself, oh, I was there when this thing first came up. So, it's a long time. I think it's a good idea for a lot of countries to be able to have dedicated people showing up every year, because that institutional memory has to be there. But it is a big challenge for a lot of developing countries, for a lot of smaller countries where there is a resource constraint, where they're not able to send the same people every year. Whereas if you look at the more developed countries, you see a different trend. And I'm putting it out there because I'm sure that the rest of you will also be able to relate to this very real logistical challenge. So I really am quite the anomaly for having gotten to go 3 times, and this is I must say this is due to the support of CYNP. However, as an individual negotiator, especially coming from a small developing country, there is a lot of onus placed on you. But then that is the essence of being a good negotiator, right? Preparation, knowing the text, really being familiar with the dynamics, how you might want to play on these dynamics to get the best outcome possible. But unfortunately for Article 6, there was no decision, which was very shocking for me to experience. I never thought that this would happen, but it happened, and yeah, it was quite jarring. So there's no text. Countries basically could not come to an agreement on what the final decision should be. And again, I am happy to go into the specifics of what were the issues. So I'll stop it at here.
Yeah. Yeah, so you mentioned, like, with regard to significant development, that there was no decision on Article 6. So, for our audience, could you just briefly tell us what is Article 6 in a line or two, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is a very interesting negotiation track. It is often viewed as very technical and esoteric, but trust me, don't be intimidated by that. You just need to get the hang of the language. Okay, let me start by saying that Article 6 is the only mechanism in the Paris Agreement which allows countries to voluntarily cooperate with each other. And by that, it means that countries can create carbon credits by doing new projects and trade that. But because this is the UNFCCC regime, we don't say certain things, right? So we don't say carbon credits. We say ITMOs, which stands for Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcomes. And that is for 6.2. So Article 6.2 is much more decentralized. It allows two or more countries to come together and just create some sort of agreement on how these projects are to be done, how these credits are to be created. And the UN kind of has a very light touch on how this entire arrangement is made. There is something called corresponding adjustment. So if Bhutan sells 100 units to India, for example, that 100 is subtracted from India's nationally determined contribution, so the accounting. But here's the twist: 100 is added onto my account. And this is how they prevent something called double counting. Now, what kind of activities qualify? So something to keep in mind is this word called additionality. So whatever carbon credits cannot be created out of something that is already there. ITMOs can't be created out of that. So you have to look at something new. So like a new forestry project, a new energy project, a new clean cooking project. So the value added basically has to be additional, and then you can create the ITMOs out of it. There are two more things very briefly. Article 6.4. Now, this is the UN's intention of creating a global carbon market. And you know that there is something called the voluntary carbon markets, which already exist. Within the UN, there is also the Kyoto Protocol, under which we had something called the Clean Development Mechanism, which funded energy projects and then created units. Now they're planning to shift all of that into this one big thing. And here again, carbon credits are called Article 6.4 ERs or A6.4 emissions reductions. Finally, there is something called Article 6.8. Trust me, I'm really coming close to finishing this. And this is on something called non-market mechanisms. So, where there are ITMOs and A6.4 ERs, there is a financial transaction taking place. But then 6.8 says cooperation is not only about financial transactions. We have to have something that represents the spirit of cooperation for adaptation, mitigation, etc. But there is no financial transaction involved. So these are the three elements of Article 6, and congrats, now you know everything about it.
Thank you for that crash course. Thank you for breaking that down, though. It was helpful. I quickly come to Elizabeth now. Please, you also share with us what were the significant developments from your particular track and in COP in general, which stood out for you. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I actually forgot to mention the track I was following. It was Just Transition. I did also want to try to follow adaptation, but when you get to COP, as everyone here knows on the panel, it's a completely different story and very hard to follow more than one. But just in terms of the developments, there were 2 points that I actually wanted to kind of share on today specifically, and I think I'll end with my track. But the one thing that I really did find to be interesting was how there were many youth dialogues taking place while negotiations were happening, and these dialogues were taking place specifically to discuss ways of amplifying youth voices in these decision-making places. I thought this was very interesting because right next door, we've got negotiators actually making these decisions for them. And so, these youth leaders are asking leaders who are present, how can we have our voices heard effectively? And no one leader specified pathways that young people can actually use and utilize to actually have their perspectives acknowledged and respected. In terms of when it comes to negotiations specifically. Sorry, I know there's also the advocacy side. So I wanted to just touch on that because I think, engaging in pre-COP negotiations is actually essential coming into COP, because this is when your country is actually determining their stance and what they're actually going to be negotiating on and how. And so I think this is something that wasn't touched on throughout all the youth dialogues that I was present in during COP28, that I wish they actually had touched on. I was really trying to observe for the most part because it was my first COP. Charlene here was actually one of my mentors. Every day I'd be messaging her, asking her, what does this mean? So that was really helpful. Thank you, Charlene. But I found that really interesting. And I think it's really important for young people to know more of just the pathways first of how you can ensure that your voices are heard. Pre-COP negotiations are essential. Make sure that you're part of the decision-making process of what your country decides their stance is before they come into COP. Because once they're in COP, they are just arguing their point. There's a very small chance of them actually changing that during that time. I think it's also really critical that young people really understand the UN infrastructure and how it works and operates. And I think this is what was really brilliant about the program that Hita and her team run, is they really took the time to explain these things to us. And even now, after a year-long training, I'm still learning. But it's critical to understand because when you are in these platforms, you need to really know how you can utilize them, maximize them, and leverage so that we can feel somewhat satisfied when we do depart from these negotiation rooms or from the advocacy events that you're taking part in. And there's just the whole COP experience in general. And I learned that was something I really learned from last year that I really am taking back home to my youth. And we're running a project. We're drafting a project now to actually be able to help our younger negotiators for COP29 and COP30. The last thing is, yes, Just Transition track that I was following. I think we all know one of the biggest apparent milestones of COP28 was that they call it the beginning of the end of fossil fuels. And so the president's text agreed that there would be a phasing away from fossil fuels instead of the phasing out that Pacific Islands were pushing the entire time. Charlene, that was our red line, wasn't it? So it was really disheartening actually for me to see that was the outcome and for the world to kind of acknowledge that as a milestone, because I think it's only a milestone when the most vulnerable can agree that it is. We should be able to feel that it's definitely impacting us impacting us, or at least going to very soon. And the fact that this phasing away term doesn't actually help us as swiftly as we need it to, I think for me was a really big letdown. And even more so that the world was acknowledging it as a big milestone. And in saying this, by the way, when I was writing my notes on this, I was like, I actually feel terrible for saying that I'm not grateful for this outcome, because it is a positive direction. It's just not where we, the most vulnerable, and we also contribute nothing to this whole issue, are suffering. And so I don't think it's reflective of the real needs of the most vulnerable. So yes, I will leave it to those 2 points, and maybe we can discuss other points later.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for sharing those points, because as young person, of course, it's harder to get in and understand the complexity of the entire process. But still, getting in and also participating actively, I think that really speaks about the efforts and the conviction that young people, they are getting together for this. I'd like to come to Charlene to build on it, and from the Pacific context, if you can share your insights and your experience at COP. Over to you. You're on mute.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I was ready to go ahead. Yep, sure. So like I said, I was following the topic mitigation, and mitigation is still quite a young, I think, topic, because it was only the mitigation work program was only established at COP26 through Decision 1, I think it was, yeah. And so at that one, parties initiated this work program to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade. And so at COP27, parties reached an agreement on the mitigation work program. And so in terms of last year's COP28, I guess my experience at that as a new negotiator was interesting, because we didn't really get a decision, just like the Article 6. It kind of just went, we were full on in negotiations. I guess parties couldn't agree on certain things, and it just was a lot of back and forward with the co-facilitators, to the point where the president assigned ministerial peers, and I believe it was from Norway and Singapore, to conduct ministerial consultations with group of parties to identify and resolve political differences, and I guess to gather feedback as well, to input in the proposed COP28 package, because as we all know, I think the COP28 presidency was quite ambitious with, during the banger on the 12th of December. Unfortunately for my thematic area, we didn't get a decision till after. So I think we were at the airport that day when, which was, 13th, when we actually found out that our decision came out. But there was a lot of, I also found interesting was not only were you in your groups or whoever you're affiliated with, but you start making friends with other groups as well, just so you can combine, I guess, your forces in terms of trying to push your message or whatever you're negotiating into the text as well. But I guess that's all for me in my mitigation space. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And now coming to Leah, please go ahead and share, how you introduce some very technical terms in the introduction as well. If you can break them a little bit and then go forward with your insights, that will be really helpful.
Yes, thank you. I actually wanted to pick up on a couple of things that everyone said because that was amazing, and thank you, Namga, for the crash course. So I negotiated on adaptation and transparency. Just so you know, I negotiated on transparency last year as well. So last year it was just transparency. This year I picked up an extra topic because we have, like everyone mentioned, developing countries. I think we can all agree our delegations might be big in numbers, but it's mostly civil societies, organizations. The actual negotiators are like 4 or 5 people, and that's maximum number of people negotiating. The rest are just green zone and pavilions. And I don't know about you guys, but I didn't even see the green zone this year. So uh, for me, I think similarly to Elizabeth, it was disappointing, the outcomes. I think for the global goal and adaptation, or what is now known the UAE framework for global climate resilience for some reason. It's after 2 years of workshops and trying to figure out what the framework should look like, the targets should be, the indicators should be, it's really a shame that we have to do another workshop or another, 2-year program to actually assess the indicators before we go to Brazil. So that's for the GGA. For the NAPS, National Adaptation Plans, it was also disappointing. There was no decision. Everything was, postponed till the SBs on adaptation. For transparency, it was more from my personal perspective, because I'm working on drafting the BTR and have been on for the past 6 months before we got to COP. I'm already know my way around, but it's just the articles that tackle the funding for support on technical capacity building or any type of financing. Those are the negotiations that I was sitting in at, because we managed to have some impact through the coordinators. As far as what I saw, yeah, that's for the tracks. I mean, for the tracks, honestly, I thought the outcomes could have been a lot better, and I think that takes me to my next point. So, basically, what stood out for me this year are, and one of the reasons that I managed to even get that perspective is the accessibility that I had through my head of delegation. I managed to attend a lot of meetings on his behalf, which I sat in rooms where, the decisions that are taken that kind of make you feel like you want to take a shower afterwards at COP were taken. So I managed to see, and exactly kind of, because Elizabeth mentioned the structure of the UNFCCC, right? So I managed to get a glimpse at the political backdoor to that structure and how influential the politics are within the system, although they should not be. So I think that is something, and I keep also, Namgai knows how much I emphasize on this, because when you see how nuanced the system is in a way, or how easily it can be infiltrated because of foreign policies or because of, agreements on different levels, you learn to maneuver it in a different way. And I think one of the strongest negotiators that I know in this, ecosystem have a lot of a little experience and a lot of backgrounds. So because they get to see things from different perspectives, right? So you have a little bit of finance, a little bit of foreign policy, a little bit of business, like Charlene mentioned. So you get to look at things from different perspective. And at COP28, I realized how politicized and how much, which takes me back to what Namge said about the government involvement, how much you should embed yourself, even though you might not be part of your government or negotiating specifically, you have to be negotiating with the government. But if you're not part of the government, you still have to embed yourself within, those meetings, those sessions, understand, like Elizabeth mentioned, everything before you go there, what's their position, get your input there, so they can put you in a position to be able to leverage your skills, to have influence. So from that perspective, I would say the most significant thing that stood up for me is that I understood, that you have to understand the politics of things, and really it's a political game more than it is technical negotiations. Everyone understands the urgency. So the big why, as you know, when we say, well, if everyone sees the urgency, why don't they do something? The big answer to that is politics. And there is no it's I thought it was outside of the UN system. It dominates the UN system. And that is something that I understood this year. And the second thing, which also Elizabeth mentioned, sorry, you talked before me, although I did have notes, I scribbled. Uh, the second thing that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on is how much I saw a shift, because I saw it last year as well in Egypt, when one of the coordinators for the Pacifics, or SIDS, I think, he was very young, and I was like, okay, they're bringing new players into the game. And I saw it this time around as well. The coordinator for G77 from Suriname was also very young, Brittany, I think she was called. And you see people, and even my boss mentioned this, like everyone his generation, which is not that old, like talking 10, maybe 15 years older than us, has moved on to even higher positions. They climbed up the ladder, and you see more of us, right? And these are the faces that you're gonna see for the next 10 years. Sorry. But I mean, once you enter this sphere, there's no leaving it unless, you go the private sector route or whatever. So the only way is kind of like dig a deeper hole of yourself. So another thing that we can leverage, and I've learned this from personal experience, is honestly create a network, even in rooms where you also feel like you need the shower afterwards, because you will have to leverage these people at some point. I mean, I don't necessarily, or we don't necessarily as a country, we're much more ambitious than other countries in the League of Arab groups, right? So, but we're also part of the Cartagena dialogue because of that ambitious, NDCs, and we're part of the G77. So I would much rather give my input in the G77 or in the CD group than in the Arab group. However, I have to be there to be able to know where that is heading. So also, because I've seen, we're young people, we have the I'll do it or I won't kind of mentality, very, let's say, extremist. What I learned is that you have to be able to say hi with a very big smile on your face to people you will never talk to in your life, So uh, that was my personal, sorry if I'm dragging on, but I feel like this is like very therapeutic, but I feel like this is something that everyone needs to know if you work in this space, just like for sanity purposes, that it is basically a giant chess game slash game theory situation where you have to be really patient, you have to play the long game. And from a bringing it back to COP perspective, I don't feel necessarily like the profile of the country where COP's going to be held this year is very different than the one from last year. So I think we're gonna have an even bigger fight ahead of us. So I think those are a couple of things to hold on to throughout the whole thing.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that so candidly, and I'm glad it was therapeutic in some way. But to sum it all up, in terms of developments, what we saw was, okay, transition away has been included, but is it sufficient? Okay, it might be a positive direction, but not enough. What I heard was, inconclusive or postponed decisions, politics, disappointing. Action not enough. So I think these phrases really stay, and also I could hear a lot of I could feel exhaustion from the involvement in this system. So while being in that space of exhaustion and disappointment, where the outcomes are not what we really expect for real action, but at the same time, what I also heard from you all was how lobbying with people, with nations, or networking, or having a community or a circle where you can, actually communicate and you have some kind of bonding there, really helps to get through this entire, system, or just keep going in this process. So I would come to the next round, which is essentially this, I'd like to hear more of your stories and something that really helps you keep going in this overwhelming, as Leah put it, the game theory, or, what is your game theory, or, how do you keep going in this space, and what are the stories that you've come across, whether it be pre-COP or during or post-COP, which has, sort of stayed with you and shaped you as a person as well, apart from a diplomat. So yeah, I would like to, give it to Elizabeth. Would you like to start?
So just to clarify, last year was my first ever COP. My climate, initiatives have been for over the last 6 years. And I've only ever engaged virtually to COP for all those other times. So I don't think I'm the best person to be giving advice on how to last or anything, because I think there's been so many more people who've been in this space far longer than me that I'm still learning from. But I mean, yes, even from that one COP, I feel like I'm still recovering. It was really overwhelming, especially given the outcomes were completely disappointing for me. And it wasn't just disappointing, like it was heart shattering, because this slowness in pace means that my islands, are suffering even more. And that just, it becomes very personal. And so just on how I've even managed to kind of stay sane, I guess, is really having that support system around you, I think is really important. I rely heavily on my mentors. Some of these mentors are national leaders, some of them are faith-based. And I think it's really important to surround yourself with these really strong individuals who have been through similar experiences as well, where they're fighting for your country too, and they're still doing it, but they've lasted. And just hearing from them how to kind of navigate forward, and see the positive still without being just so angry and frustrated, has been really tremendously helpful for me. And I think that's one of my first go-tos, obviously, as well as just focusing on the little things that you can control, I think is also very important. This whole space can get very overwhelming. Obviously climate affects every part of our lives, from, gender issues to even business, and so on. And so I think you need to really just kind of identify where it is that you are in this whole space and how it is that you can contribute. Sometimes that does look for people like just avoiding plastics. That's okay. Any contribution actually does matter. And I think it's important to not feel so, oh my gosh, this is too much and it's overwhelming, I'm just not going to do anything. Know that every small bit counts, and your part is very valuable in this whole effort for all of us. So yes, I think those are the two ways I've kind of managed myself.
Yeah, I think it does make a lot of sense to, focus on things you can control. And since you visited, you attended it for the first time, that was a young person, and I think that is really helpful for a lot of young people who are also joining today or would be seeing this conversation. So thank you. And over to Namge, we'd like to hear your stories that you'd like to share, some of them.
Sure. So I'll divide it as things that would be useful for negotiators and also aspiring negotiators. And then the second part would be for those of you who are just looking to get involved in the UNFCCC process. For me, one of the biggest things I've had to reflect about is on the level of autonomy that you want to negotiate within your own country team, in terms of, who you want to talk to, who you want to reach out to and connect with, and what you want to say. Because there is a lot of dynamics. As a country, you cannot do there and you cannot go there and do whatever you want, in a sense. if you belong to a group. So a lot of the times it's a big faux pas to delineate from your group's position. And then you have to handle that as well. But perhaps um, within the group position, there are certain things that do not necessarily align with your specific country position. So I'm saying that there are these instances, and it's so important for negotiators to have a pulse not only of the dynamics between countries and between groups, but also with your own negotiating team. Agree with everything that Elizabeth shared about self-care. Yeah, it's a long game. People have been in this space for 20 years, 15 years, and you have to show up year after year. You have to be prepared, goes without saying. You have to know the text, you have to know the history. For those of you who are, curious about, what happens at a COP, and how do you become a young negotiator? How can I get involved? I do get a lot of these questions as well. I just would say that try to get a sense of how whatever decisions are being made at that level ultimately translates back into your home country. So, for example, Leah was mentioning things like the LEDs, Low Emissions Development Strategy, or the NAPS, National Adaptation Plan. And these are the bigger things mandated as national communications because your country signed on to the Paris Agreement. But then, everybody on the ground is feeding into that information. And this is where civil society, youth groups, who else? The government, of course, and everybody is supposed to feed in the information there. And it's really quite interesting to see how all these things connect at a different level. So you actually might be involved in the UNFCCC process without really knowing it. So yeah, to look out for how all the pieces and the dots connect would be something that I would throw out as a suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah, often whenever we have this discourse on international policy making, we get so lost in the terms and terminologies that we forget that how important grassroots action is, and the small actions that we do, and we don't even know what to do, or we don't even know we are a part of the process, but we are. Do you want to add something? You've raised, yes.
Yeah, I forgot to add this. It's incredibly frustrating too, just being entrenched in this system. And I have a lot of faith on grassroots action, but also from other sectors like academia, the scientific community, and for the markets. Like, you wouldn't believe how something so technical supposedly can become so political to the point where the whole thing just fell apart. And frankly speaking, I have a lot more faith in the private sector, because I'm looking at how bodies like Vera, that does standard setting for methodologies for the voluntary carbon market projects, have moved so quickly. In just 1 year, they have gotten together a lot of things, and of course they're not without criticism as well. But you gotta say the speed at which the private sector moves is really impressive. And when you're in the bulky UNFCCC process where it looks like it'll take, I don't know, 5 more years, you gotta yeah, you really require a lot of resilience and a lot of patience.
Yeah, makes sense. Of course, it needs to be multi-stakeholder in nature, not one, but all the stakeholders need to come together, whatever, regardless of the profession or the nature of the sector be. And now I'll come to Charlene. We talked about negotiating rooms and how the sense of community or network becomes very important while being from different countries, holding different positions, but still having that understanding with the negotiators who are holding different positions. So how does that interplay look like? And any anecdotes from you are also welcome. Charlene, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I thought in regards to my experience, what was quite helpful for me was the CYMP program. So, and learning the UNFCCC processes and terminologies, I thought that was quite helpful for me going into these negotiation rooms and understanding all of that. But what was also helpful for me was my delegation that attended. So my head of delegation was our director for climate change, and he's been at COP since COP 1. So he's what we like to say a dinosaur in the COP space. So I would go to him in terms of if I didn't understand anything or if I needed clarity in certain terms or so he was quite helpful to me. And fortunately for me, we worked for the same government agency, so Office of the Prime Minister, and his office is literally next door. So prior to going to COP, I would be in his office or he'll be in my office, and we just keep bugging each other. But I think if you are going to go into these spaces, what should you be learning or taking with you is understanding your country context, what your country needs, what you're fighting for. So when you do go into these spaces and whatever groups you're affiliated with, you are putting those your position forward, and then collectively in your groups that even takes it up to another level. What is also very helpful as well is if you have a minister attending, and most likely all countries will have either their Minister of Climate Change or Prime Minister at these forums, and I guess having briefings with him so he understands, so he can take when pretty sure all leaders will be giving statements, or ministers of climate change will be giving statements. So they're inserting that aspect into their statements as well. So that also gives you leverage into that higher level platform. I thought that was quite helpful for us as well, especially coming from a small island state where we're mostly impacted and vulnerable. What I also felt was quite helpful as well is when you're in these negotiation rooms. So sometimes it can be a bit of a blur, but when you feel passionately about this, and sometimes you go into these rooms, you don't have a statement already, or some may, but others may have might be writing their negotiation speech right then and there because there's something that kind of you felt something that's like not hitting the room. So I think what is helpful is bringing your experience, your country experience, and inserting that into your speeches when you give these negotiations. Because, for example, for the Cook Islands, we live and the Pacific nations as well. We are living in these experiences where we are impacted in climate change. So currently we are in our cyclone season, and it's extremely hot. And as we know through the IPCC last year was the hottest year ever. So giving even these small experiences and inserting it into your statements is helpful as well, so people can understand why we are fighting for what we are fighting for. And yeah, I thought that was, as well as having, because it does get quite frustrating in terms of you have your meetings or informals in the morning, and then you're there for the whole day. So what do you do for that whole day? So luckily there is pavilions that you can attend, but also it's a good time to start being friends with other groups as well. So you can understand their side and they can understand your side, and where you guys can, I guess, compromise to a certain extent, I guess. And yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I think thanks like refocusing on the power of why, behind the what. So the urgency is also so like becomes more clearer when people know the context that we come from, and how important it is to pay heed to the vulnerable communities, especially those who are directly facing the impacts, and also for the anecdotes that you shared in the beginning. So now, Leah, of course, coming to you, I'd really like you to break down the term game theory that you mentioned earlier. And how do you look at it? And especially, we haven't like covered yet, like how does behind the scenes look like in terms of how you prepare yourself as a negotiator when you leave the country to an international negotiation like this. So if you could also put some light on that, it'll be wonderful.
Thanks. Well, I'm gonna start with that actually, because then I can probably remember the haze that was the 6 months like of the COP season. So before COP starts, I think like a couple of months before COP started, I have two bosses. That's basically our team, three people. We work on everything. So one I read the national communications with, and I do all the reporting with, and one is the politics guy and the advisor for the minister, and that's who I do all the other, COP season, SB season stuff with. And like a couple of months before COP, I belonged to him, and she forgot my existence. So we started with registering everyone, setting up the pre-meetings, pre-COP meetings, bringing in. I did like a voluntary basis thing with universities to bring in youth interested in going to COP and kind of tap into the potential of that. We managed to get like 4 or 5 people as well into the delegation. So I also had to look at all of the events that are happening. And like Charlene mentioned, when you work in the ministry and your office is like right there at the minister's office, I drafted his entire calendar, picking the events where we can highlight our work and drafting his speeches. So basically, and also the prime minister's statements, I drafted as well. So basically, you get to say what you want to say. You get to plan 5 years ahead for the entire country, embed that in their schedule, and just send them off. So that is like basically the haze that was my pre-COP preparation, as well as preparing for the negotiations, which is like an entire monster on its own. You have to read all the documents, you have to prepare yourself, you have to know what were the outcomes of the SPs, kind of see, because there is wasted time in those rooms. I mean, there's the comma for 3 hours, like, sessions. Do we shift the comma? Do we leave the comma? So if you already know all of that, you can spend those 3 hours doing something completely more productive. So that's how I managed to kind of have 2 topics this year, is because I had transparency down, right? I knew what I wanted to attend. I knew specifically which sessions I wanted to tap into, give my opinion, get out. So I managed to do adaptation as well. But most importantly, I think in my prep process was my boss, which Yuta knows. He's I think I got very lucky with him. He is a institutional memory for the country. I think not COP 1, Charlene, he's not that old, but I think he was like around COP 10, so 12. And he puts you in touch with the right people. He sets you up so you kind of absorb as a sponge, if that makes sense. He's like, go into that room, and then you just end up listening for something for 3 hours that you have no idea what it is. And then when you come back home, he's like, oh, we have this new project. Oh, that's why you want me to listen to that for 3 hours to prep me for this, So there's I got lucky with the person that I was attending COP with, and I got lucky with the fact that I'm positioned in a place in the ministry and in a team that actually has influence over the ministry, over his schedule, over what he says, over what he does. So we get to kind of embed our targets, which is why our NDCs are a little bit much more ambitious than NDCs in the region. And I think going back to what Elizabeth said about sanity, my sanity is there's a couple of people in this session and then a couple of other people that are not here. But when you're at COP, I mean, Namgay can vouch for all the alcohol that we drank and all of the late night, ranting over sessions that went bad or topics that we can't tolerate anymore or meetings with people we cannot stand, So that system that the CYMP kind of facilitated of a network, it's not even a network anymore. It's kind of like friends to an extent when you spend 2 weeks 24/7 with people. It becomes like family. So, and you get to see them twice a year and prep for that, throughout the entire year. So I think that is that's like how I maintained my sanity, is having those people around. So yeah, that's
Yes. And yeah, I'm so glad that today we all are also here as a community to reflect on things and hear each other. And as we get closer to the time, so I've been seeing some comments on the chat. I'd request audience to put in their questions simultaneously in the chat box. We will soon open it up for all of you to interact. And before that, I'd request all of you, if you can switch on your videos, we can take a group photograph as a memory of this discussion. So all of you in the audience, please feel free to switch on your videos and we can take the photograph. Okay. Are we ready? Yes, more and more faces. Thank you for switching on the video. On my count, 3, 2, 1. And it's done. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So I think we can now open it up for the audience as well. I'm sure they would have questions and we have already one hand raised. So we would let you unmute and you could go ahead with the question. Kasim, if I'm...
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is already mentioned in the chat. You can follow it and then you can answer it. Thank you so much.
Yes, if you'd like to speak the question out. So
my question is, what happened if human rights violate human life in the context of organizing crime? So who's gonna get involved? As it is mentioned that there is no difference between the company and the state. Who's gonna get involved on this matter? Thank you.
Thank you. Would any of you like to comment on it? I think what he wants to delve into is linkage with the human rights and the tiff between the state and the state and the private sector. So if you want to share some comments on it.
Sorry, guys. I'm just gonna put it out there. So I think human rights right now, and speaking as someone that is coming from a countries that is kind of like, let's say, quote unquote, in war situation. I think everyone, I speak personally, but I think I've talked to a lot of people at COP. We all feel like we're being failed somehow by human right laws right now, right? Because it's whatever is supposed to be like this overarching system that is protecting everyone. And when you start feeling like that system is a little bit politicized or not as transparent as it should be, it trickles down to all aspects of life, including climate change and including the decisions that are taken at COP. So I think from that sense, if that is the question or that is what you mean, then all we can do is, because I always, whenever I get super frustrated about why do we keep coming to COP if, you know, nothing ever changes, or if we keep just adding work programs to avoid adding decisions, or, I mean, like Elizabeth mentioned, the just transition and her disappointment on transition. You have no idea what the text was like before they had their little, you know, secret meetings and added just transition. So even that win was a struggle, especially considering where we were and who the actors involved were, from a, you know, actors that blatantly violate human rights. So if that is what you mean, that I think my answer to that would be what I answer myself every time I ask that question, which is, what if we never showed up? What if all of that didn't take place? The narrative, the conversation. Then it's a carte blanche, you know, do whatever. Take all the decisions you want, whether it's, you know, it's for economic profit, private sector, what, it'll be a free for all, which is why I think, even as frustrating as it may be, and as much as we feel, or I feel personally, like I'm kind of like on the moral, I'm towing the moral line, someone has to do it. So that's why I'm like, okay, imagine if we were not there. So the entire pyramid would crumble. At least that's my opinion. Anyone else? Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Leila was saying. I think it's also important to have your voice heard at the table. You know, yeah, it will be frustrating at times, and you know, sometimes we question ourselves, why are we here? If it's just the same old process that happens, nothing's moved. But being visible and being at that table again is just as important. What is also important, I feel, is also having what do you call it? Side events. That's another area where you can put your message out across as well. And then using your social media platforms to push your message as well. That's another way you can gather audiences and yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your comments and viewpoints in it. I think it was really helpful for building on that perspective. We also have another question in the chat box by Joes, which says, how can collective action influence outcomes? Am I audible? Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Sorry, it got stuck for me. So yes, how can collective action influence COP's influence? And for people who want to pursue action, what can the trajectory look like, and what actions can they get involved in to begin with? Yes, please, Namgin, go ahead.
Yeah, very much related to what the previous discussion was. I would simply say that we can't let certain things slide, right? So all of us are saying that we're really not happy with the kind of collective action that we are seeing at the UNFCCC level. And at the end of the day, it really is the responsibility for the rest of us, and that includes civil society, journalists, youth groups, to speak truth to power. I'm thinking of how the whole UNFCCC regime began in the first place, which was in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. For a long time, it was a very niche scientific community that was bringing attention to how human activity is changing our planet's climate. And had it not been for a lot of effort over the years, most notably culminating in James Hansen, who was with NASA, giving a testimony in front of the US Congress. That then brought one of the most important players into the picture. But in addition to these very powerful actors who need to be convinced, who need to be brought on board, we must also remember that it's also the smallest countries that appear to have the least resources, that appear to have the smallest voice, who can sometimes come and really be the catalyst and bring the kind of moral weight that we need to for everyone to do better. So we must never forget that. We must never give up on that. And I think that's how I view collective action.
Yeah. Anybody else would like to add to it?
I think just to go off what Namge was saying, which I completely agree with, but just maybe to example one of the what I believe to be one of the greatest examples of what happens when there is collective action and how it does actually make an impact in places like COP. I don't know if you're familiar, Jose, with the Pacific Island students fighting climate change. They were campaigning to seek an advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice, and that has been adopted, which is a huge milestone for us in the Pacific, because we are then able to hold these countries who are responsible for the highest emitters in the world to account for the suffering that we are going through. And so I think that's just two examples, going off what Namge was saying, just an example that you can look at to reference just the impact of collective action. It definitely does help because collective action actually makes our leaders act because there's more pressure on them. So, yeah.
Right. And I think both of you mentioned about collaboration and unity in terms of demanding and acting for it. And I think there was one statement which also talked about how they are not small island nations but big ocean countries. So how important it is to realize our strengths and work towards it more effectively and respect each other for the strengths. Thank you for that perspective. I can see one more hand raised. Is it Sabatha, if I'm pronouncing it rightly?
Yes.
Would you like to unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hey, can you hear me now? Oh, wait. Hold. Okay. I think you can hear me now. So my name is Sabata from South Africa, and I like the discussion. I think South Africa is relevant because ports and trade link us with a lot of islands. My question is, would Model UN be a way to bring people into this whole discussion, or is there another way to get people from a student space straight into a COP space?
Yeah, very.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. So I wanted to jump in because we're working on something similar.
Yes, please.
Guys, am I lagging or? Okay, so I just wanted to jump in because we're working on something similar in Lebanon now, and we were thinking actually, which brings me back to my boss, he pokes me into good ideas, and we were having a conversation about how many negotiators we would need if they keep adding work programs without having any decisions to wrap up the previous work programs. It was just a joke out of my frustration of having an additional work program for the GGA. And then we realized, oh, next year, I'm either going to have to add loss and damage to my list, or we're going to need a couple new negotiators with, substantial technical expertise, not some XY person in the ministry who just want to travel, So we thought about getting, and not maybe at the high school level, because we already did this program where we added climate change topics and the structure of UNFCCC into the curriculum, you know, so people can have access, will have access to that through primary and high school education. But for the purpose of being able to infuse them in COP, I think everyone here will agree it is an intensely terrifying space if you're someone that is 19, 18, 20. I mean, I would imagine 20-year-old me would sit in a corner and cried. So I don't, without proper preparation, that transition is going to be extremely difficult, because it's like absorbing so much information that you short circuit, you know? I mean, that was the reason that we didn't short circuit year one, that's also personal opinion, is because of the training we got from CYMP. So I think what we're doing now in Lebanon is we got 5 of the major universities in the country, and we got them to nominate based, of course, on specific criteria, you know, 5 or 6 people from each university that work in climate change, and those are going to go through a training program that we're developing, so they can get acquainted with the space. So whenever other programs like CYMP come in, you know, or CYMP moving forward, you will have more people going into those programs, more people coming out of those programs, hence more people in the team moving into the negotiations, you know? So you would be able to prep them for the process. And I think that is the link of like linking people from an education perspective or at the university level. I don't think we should traumatize younger people by bringing them into this process too soon. I think university level is the right way or the right age for them to transition. But for sure, primary high school is more than, you know, they should know this stuff. Knowledge should be there. But I think they need much more understanding of the entire system, and the pressure of it requires a level of maturity that I don't think teenagers have yet. Although they are very knowledgeable, but there's a lot of pressure, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And what Samantha also mentioned was like mock parliaments or mock United Nations, which students have internally in their own high schools and campuses. I think that can also prepare them for this space, not at the moment, but in future maybe. I hope that answered your question. And if you all have any other questions, please put it in the chat. But because we are running short of time, I would also request speakers to put in their contact details in terms of like email ID or any social media handle where they can approach you directly, probably. And yes, we are almost towards the closing. So I would request you all to give some concluding remarks. Any hopes? You could also share the next steps or the hopes that you have from the coming COP or anything in the climate space. So your hopes or vision and concluding remarks. Would you like to start, Charlene? Or Elizabeth? Anybody? Okay. Who would like to go?
Oh,
Is taking
awesome.
notes. I think Charlene can start, so we can let Charlene go. Just
Sorry,
like
I was just writing my email address in the chat group for anyone who wants to directly have questions. But I think from I guess going forward, for me would be I'm still working closely with our climate change team. We've just finalized our report from COP28, and I guess looking forward, we will be gearing up for the June session in Bonn. But I know prior to that, we are also looking at, I guess, funding for well, obviously looking for funding in terms of to help support us. But we also have the 4 SIDS coming up in Antigua, which also includes some climate change aspects in that as well. So we're looking at attending that as well as SB and then leading up to COP. So it's still very I guess, new year, still trying to get back into the swing of things, but also looking at our country context and our country position and looking at the outcomes from COP and how will we move forward, or how will we, I guess, position ourselves better for the next iteration, but as well as working with our other dialogue partners, other parties, moving forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And you pass it on to?
I can go next.
Yes.
Yeah. I can't believe it's just been like a year since I've been part of this process, but I already feel so old and so tired. But the work ahead definitely is immense. I'm looking forward to, just in the context of my negotiation track, contribute to creating viable markets in Bhutan, getting some projects off the ground under Article 6. We have a MOU and a plan with Singapore, who's also one of the early movers in this space. But I think beyond that, it's really been such an incredible experience for me, because I always say I never thought I would be at a negotiating table at the age that I got there at, because I thought I'll be doing that's something that you do in your 40s or maybe your like 50s. But I feel that I mustn't let this experience and exposure go to waste. And I'm very much interested in how I can pay it forward in terms of the skills, the network that I have been able to gain, and of course, all the wonderful friends that I've been able to make through this whole journey. So that's going to be exciting for me, and what's going to be keeping me optimistic.
Thank you. Leah?
Yeah, I just wanted to say Namge was talking about me, so just so everyone knows, I'm the important. Okay, so on a national level, there's a lot of stuff. My plate is pretty full with the low emission development strategy that well, again, I say we, it's me, I'm drafting. And then the BTR is due in December, so it's gonna also be pretty crazy. So that's, here. On the negotiation aspect, the work program for the indicators for the GJA is kicking off this year. So I need to get myself acquainted and kind of embed myself in that structure early on. I'm looking forward to the SBs because anyone that was on adaptation will tell you we did not negotiate and we should all be fired. So I'm looking forward to actually negotiating at the SBs from a technical standpoint on the GGA, and see where that's going to go moving forward, and the NAPS as well. Hopes from the coming COP, I don't know. Honestly, I've only been in this space for 2 years, so I think hopefully it'll be good. It'll be better than last year. But again, we go back to politics, knowing the country, knowing the foreign policy, knowing the economy. I hope we get something better on mitigation, but otherwise, I also really hope that we highlight a little bit adaptation this year, a little bit more at least, or put more emphasis on it, because the wins or the quick wins that we got on loss and damage this year and last year are great, but if we increase finance and if we increase work on adaptation, we kind of reduce the amount of money we have to put in loss and damage. So do I feel like things are changing in general? I love all of these discussions that we keep having with young individuals that are, very well informed. I love that there's much more of us in this space and much more established relationships where you don't have to be at 100 places at the same time because someone whose feedback you trust is going to be there and they can loop you in, from different groups, different parties as well. So hopefully because of these different changes and dynamics, things will change a little bit, out with the old a little bit, in with the new. But I'm not gonna lie and say I'm extremely optimistic, but I guess we'll see how the SBs go. I think the SBs set the tone for COP. I mean, last year at the SBs, we all knew COP was going to be a disaster because the agenda got adopted the last day of the SBs. So I think we'll see how the sessions in June go. And based on the momentum there, we can kind of have an idea of what COP will be like.
Elizabeth?
Thank you. Yes, so just going off what my colleagues just shared, just to close off, I wanted to first of all thank CYNP for creating a pathway for young people to meaningfully engage in such a platform like COP28. That was really inspiring for me to actually take part in. And despite COP also being just such a huge platform, especially for us in the Pacific, to negotiate our needs with other countries, I think it's also crucial to just remember the work that you're doing outside of COP and how crucial that is to the overall cause of climate action and moving away from increasing the issues that we face. So yes, and I'm also looking forward to the SBs as well. Leave it to that.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. And although we are a little unsure at this point about the coming times, but one thing that I am sure and I'm hopeful about is, this conversation, because as a young person, it has been like a really inspiring conversation to hear all of you and to also understand that, small actions can also play a role. And as a young person who wants to do something, it's not too late, and we have people who are actually working day and night. So thank you so much for doing what you do, and thank you for all your time and insights today, and we hope to keep in touch. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the audience. Bye.